Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the story of three women in the Civil War era. And when I say Civil War era, I usually refer to the decade before the Civil War and the decade after. And the three women are Harriet Tubman, well known for freeing herself and then freeing many others from slavery, and two white women, Martha Wright and Frances Seward. The story of their friendship and activism gives us a window into the intersection of the movement to abolish slavery and for women's rights in the middle of the 19th century. My guest for this conversation is Dorothy Wickenden. She is the executive editor of the New Yorker magazine. She also writes for the magazine and is the moderator of its weekly podcast, Politics and More. She is the author of the book, The Agitators, Three Friends Who Fought for Abolition and Women's Rights. She joins us via Zoom. Dorothy Wickenden, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
It is my pleasure to be here.
I'm excited about having this conversation. You know, it's interesting. Over the past 4 years, there have been a number of books examining or re-examining this Civil War era. And I think in large part because it seems like this era in history speaks and has spoken to us very much during especially the Trump presidency. And we'll have to see, perhaps even longer. In preparing for our conversation, I learned that the idea of this current book was actually born out of a previous book that you wrote, Nothing Daunted, about two women teachers roughing it out in Colorado in the early 20th century. And if I'm correct, one of those women was your grandmother.
Yes, and my namesake, Dorothy Woodruff.
But I do want to ask you, did this political moment that we have been living through help shape the story that you are telling about Harriet Tubman, Martha Wright, and Frances Seward?
Yes, it absolutely has. But I have to admit that I spent so long writing this book. It took 7 years. So when I began it, Barack Obama was president. And so it was, I started it with a sense of kind of inspiration about how far America had come from these days. And then as time went on, it looked as though Hillary Clinton was going to be the first female president. And then, of course, Donald Trump was elected instead. And then things took quite a different turn. But nevertheless, throughout the course of writing the book, I learned so much about the origins of racism and misogyny in this country and how consistent they have been and why they're still with us. So the way I thought about it just took different turns along the way. So in recent years, when the Me Too movement sprung up, it just resonated very loudly, as did Black Lives Matter. And more recently, the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. There's white supremacy again. It never goes away. It just goes underground for a little while and then reasserts itself. So all of these are threads in the book.
Really interesting to think of that parallel between the election of Barack Obama as president, the first black president, and then we thought we were about to have the first female president with Hillary Clinton. Obviously did not happen. And thinking about the middle of the 19th century, the Civil War era, because oftentimes when we talk about the Civil War in this era, we frequently don't talk about the combination of both the movement for abolition and for women's rights, but they were very strongly connected, and even someone like Frederick Douglass is involved in this story.
Yes, absolutely, and all three women believed, very deeply in both movements and participated in both movements. The abolitionists got started a little bit before the formal women's rights movement began, which everyone sort of places in 1848 at Seneca Falls. The truth is that there were really radical women who were working as early as the 1830s with abolitionists on the abolition movement. But Seneca Falls was the first convention devoted solely to women's rights. So right from the beginning, the two movements were closely intertwined. And that was one of the things that fascinated me as I was going through the research and trying to put these individual stories together and also put them in the broader historical context. How did the Underground Railroad work? Basically was a very effective underground experiment in American democracy that worked for about 50 years with very few betrayals. And then the Civil War broke out in 1861, and then we're in a completely different era. But what I saw as I was working my way through these decades is, and I wanted to answer the question of how social movements begin, especially social movements led by, in this case, by who are the participants are three women who have absolutely no power at all. Harriet Tubman was a fugitive slave, the most benighted member of American society. The other two women, Martha Coffin Wright, was a middle-class mother of 6 children. She was stuck at home all day, every day, doing all of her housework. Frances Seward was the aristocratic wife of a very famous statesman, William H. Seward. But she had, a house full of servants to help her with her work. But women were literally beneath notice. They were supposed to be, handmaidens to their husbands and take care of their children. And that was that. And so it was one of the ways I found that these women ended up, the women who wanted to become kind of American insurgents, because nobody believed they were capable of anything. They learned how to become pretty good at it, and they knew how to escape notice. So, and that was one thing, to find out how these three women did it together, and then each went her separate way to do, her part in the two movements.
Let's set the stage on who these three women were. We're talking about Harriet Tubman, the best remembered of these three women, but also Martha Wright and Frances Seward. Harriet Tubman obviously is best remembered for freeing herself from slavery, freeing many others, being a conductor of the Underground Railroad. That's sort of our popular imagination of Harriet Tubman. Is there anything more that you think is important to know about Harriet Tubman in this story?
Yes, and this was one of the great pleasures of writing this book, was learning more about her life. Her Underground Railroad exploits really only lasted not even quite a decade, in the 1850s. This was a woman who lived until she was 91 and who was active in human rights, broadly defined, until the very end of her life. So there were many different chapters of her life. And so once the Civil War began and the Underground Railroad ceased to exist, she decided she wanted to take part in the war. She effectively wanted to become a soldier. She couldn't become a soldier, so she created a role for herself, which was the next best thing. She had made many important contacts, in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New York State, but she knew all of the most important abolitionists in Boston. And so through her contacts in Boston, she got in to see the governor of Massachusetts, who got her permission to go down to Union-occupied Port Royal, South Carolina, and not fully defined, it wasn't fully defined what she was going to do there. But Harriet Tubman knew what she was going to do. So she told her close friend in Auburn, Martha Coffin Wright, who was one of the agitators, and they worked together on the Underground Railroad with Frances Seward. She told her that basically, I'm going to go down there and I'm going to perform a kind of secret service. And she did. She got herself known to the generals, the Union generals. She made herself indispensable as a kind of liaison between the local people, the 10,000 people who had just been freed from slavery when the Union took over that part of South Carolina. So she worked with them on a volunteer basis. And she had all these years of experience infiltrating enemy territory. So she did a version of the same thing in South Carolina. And she ended up convincing these generals and colonels to give her money to pay for 8 scouts whom she sent out to kind of figure out where the Confederate positions were, because they were surrounded on 3 sides by the Confederates, and they moved a lot. And these scouts helped her figure out where the torpedoes in the water were. They helped her figure out the lay of the land and the tides of the rivers and so on. So, and then she helped to run what was one of the most successful operations in that part of the country, which was they developed these Union generals with Harriet Tubman's assistance, developed a series of river raids. and they took their gunboats up the rivers of South Carolina and into Georgia, and they stopped at plantations which were still being run by enslaved people and by the plantation owners, and they torched the plantations, and then they freed slaves. So Harriet Tubman went on the most important, the most ambitious of these missions. I think it was in 1862. They stopped at several plantations. They torched the plantations, and the enslaved population knew that when the steamer whistle blew, that was a signal, as Harriet Tubman said, that Uncle Sam had come to set them free. So they took the gunboats up in the middle of the night. They landed at this plantation. They blew the steamer whistle, and everyone dropped what they were doing in the fields and in the houses and rushed to the river. And Harriet Tubman described all of this very vividly. She was a wonderful storyteller to her first biographer in Auburn when she had settled there after the war. And so we have these, I was able to kind of piece together her voice. She couldn't read or write, but I wanted to recreate her. I wanted to create her character in the same way I did Frances and Martha, who were easier to understand because they left all these letters behind that they wrote to their husbands and their sisters. Harriet Tubman left really basically an oral account of her personal history. So what I found was she was absolutely extraordinary in so many ways, and there were so many iterations of her life. So it's just completely wrong to think of her as, a hero because she was a conductor on the Underground Railroad.
Yeah, fascinating story about what happened in South Carolina.
Yeah.
Martha Wright, a Quaker, a mother of 7, and I guess the radical in the neighborhood.
Yes, so she was a Quaker, very, very much a Quaker, instilled with these very, very strong anti-slavery ideas. And she had been just a rebel from the time she was a little girl. Her older sister was Lucretia Mott, who was a Quaker minister, 14 years older, and was actually world renowned and despised for being one of the really early women's rights promoters and just a human rights advocate, very, very strong person. And so Martha herself had a lot of this sense that women were cut out to do a lot more than they were told that they were allowed to do. And nevertheless, she married young. She had, all of these young children who were constantly tugging at her long skirts and keeping her in the kitchen. And she had to do all the housework herself. And she just thought, this is not the life that I would have chosen for myself. And why is my life determined by these privileged white men, which is the way they thought of them at the time, who happened to found the country and decided that was the role that women were going to serve. They were going to be their spouses, always there when their spouses needed them and their children needed them. And it was Lucretia Mott. She wrote these letters to her older sister all the time and complained, and she was funny and sardonic, but angry about this. And so she had to kind of break out of that. It was called the separate sphere for women. She had to break out of that, but she didn't know quite how until the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And it was difficult because she had all these children. And when she went to Seneca Falls, she was one of the organizers at the convention with her sister Lucretia and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and 2 other women. And she was 6 months pregnant with her 7th child when she went to Seneca Falls, and she was 41 years old. And so before the convention, she just thought there was no hope. This was just going to be her life forever, and she was going to grow old and have grandchildren, and that would be that. At Seneca Falls, her eyes were opened by the total firebrand Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who absolutely refused to accept that limited role for women in their life. She was the daughter of a judge. And she had basically given herself her own legal education. She just decided these laws were completely outmoded and they had to be changed. And then Martha Wright also met Francis Douglass, who was 10 years escaped from slavery himself, was running a new newspaper in Rochester, New York, not far from Seneca Falls or from Auburn, which is where these women were from. And he agreed. They invited him to come. And he came. And Martha took the opportunity to get to know him, and they became close friends. And so whenever he came to lecture, when he came across New York State, he would stop in Auburn at her invitation and have dinner or spend the night at her house. And for that, she became, she was already a renegade, and her neighbors thought she was completely, they called her a very dangerous woman, because she was basically advocating equality not only between the sexes, but also between the races.
It's interesting. Frederick Douglass was a supporter of women's rights. But we get into this period, I guess we're jumping ahead a little bit, after the Civil War, with the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments to the Constitution. There was a lot of talk and debate at the time as if the 14th Amendment to the Constitution should also apply to women. And there was sort of a separation, a divergence that happened at that point.
Yeah, there was a really bitter separation. And that was the other thing that was really fun to explore through Martha, who basically, after the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton enlisted her as her deputy in this new movement that she was beginning. As Stanton saw it, she was put herself at the center of every story. And then Susan B. Anthony entered the picture a couple of years later. So the three of them were kind of this team. But Martha was very close to Douglass, too. So even though Martha was totally on board with this idea that women should be allowed the right to vote, as was Douglass right from the beginning, which for a man was just an unbelievable thing for him to, advocate publicly. But when the Reconstruction Amendments came up, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony absolutely felt that women had to be given the exact same rights that Black men were being given. And they were almost entirely alone in that view in the long run. Other women and men who had been their friends throughout, including Martha, who had felt painfully caught between Stanton and Anthony and Douglass, and she agreed with Douglass. But she chose to stick with the two women because, she said, I'm going to stick with my friends even when they do unwise things. So it was years and years with a complete separation, and with Anthony and Stanton basically reviled by all of their former friends. However, in the long run, in 1888, there was another convention. It was to start an international women's rights organization, and it was spearheaded by Stanton and Anthony. They invited Douglass to come. He came and he spoke, and he essentially said it was a great thing for abolitionists to free the enslaved people who had everything to lose, spent all of these decades fighting for women's rights. And I just thought that was the most generous thing he could possibly have said after this truly bitter separation, during which, I should add, Stanton and Anthony became unapologetic racists. It's painful to say, but there it is in the record. It was really bad.
Where did Harriet Tubman come down on this? And I've already thrown out the chronological sequence I was hoping to do and tell you into the story. But did this put a strain on the relationship of these three women that you write about?
It didn't. Tubman had this remarkable capacity to rise above dissension. There were always tensions among abolitionists and within the women's rights advocates. She just didn't want to have anything to do. She had much loftier ambitions to pursue, which were, we must get equality for African Americans, and we must get equality for women. So interestingly, after the war and after this split had happened, she and Anthony and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton started their own women's rights group, and they asked Harriet Tubman to join them, and she did. but she just didn't get involved in any of the internecine politics. She just somehow, and Martha, her great friend, just found this remarkable because Martha was completely entangled in all of this and was constantly writing letters to try to bring Anthony and Stanton back into the fold and couldn't do it. And Tubman she just went along. She continued to talk to groups. She would talk to all Black women's groups. She would talk to all white women's groups. She would talk to integrated groups, whoever asked her. And that was what she thought. She just had to get out the word, and she would talk to whoever asked her to speak.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Dorothy Wickenden. She's executive editor of the New Yorker magazine, also writes for the magazine, and is a moderator of its weekly podcast, which is called Politics and More. She's the author of the book that we are in conversation about. It's called The Agitators, Three Friends Who Fought for Abolition and Women's Rights. I also wanted to talk about Frances Seward and the dynamic between Frances Seward and her husband, William Seward, is fascinating. William Seward is an important political figure of the middle of the 19th century, former senator, Secretary of State, I believe, for Abraham Lincoln. He was against slavery, but I don't think we can call him an abolitionist necessarily. But that didn't go. But we could call his wife, Frances Seward, an abolitionist. Tell me about her and this relationship on these issues to her husband.
Yes, and it took her a little bit longer than it took Martha to break free of all of the restrictions on women, partly because she was highly educated. She was as educated as a woman could be in those days. She believed that she should be womanly, as she put it. She didn't want to do anything that would rock the boat. And her husband, who was he was one of the best known politicians of the 19th century. He thought, by the way, that he would not only win the Republican nomination in 1860, but that he would go on to be president. And it was, of course, Lincoln who became president, and Seward's consolation prize was being made Secretary of State. Frances hated electoral politics. She found it a sordid business. She hated the fact that there was all this deal making and money was exchanging hands in very, unscrupulous ways. And she had thought, she got married at the age of 19 when Seward was a young lawyer, and she thought that they would settle down in Auburn, which is where she'd grown up, in her family home, and that he would be a local lawyer, which is what her father had been, and they would lead a very quiet life, and they would bring up their children, and they would read together at night. She was extremely cerebral and intellectual, very interested in contemporary politics, just not getting involved in them. And Seward decided early on that he said, I loathe litigation. He didn't want to have anything to do with the law. And politics was just becoming one of the biggest businesses in the country, and he became a politician. And he was really good at it. So that was why he just kept sort of climbing the ladder. So she decided when he went to Washington, basically in 1850, as a U.S. senator, that she would live at home in Auburn. Washington was a slave. It was not only was slavery legal, it was an active market in buying and selling slaves, which she found absolutely despicable. And she did not want to be there. So they worked out a compromise. It was a very unusual marriage and a very fraught marriage. And they agreed that she would live in Auburn, he would rent a house in Washington, and that she would go down once a year it was called Washington's social season. Very rigid social hierarchy, very Southern, and that she would act in the traditional role of a senator's hostess. And he was a very gregarious, convivial man who loved having big dinner parties. And he invited all of his political foes as well as his friends. And he thought, you could loosen people up under the influence of wine and after dinner brandy and a good meal. And soon we would be able to put aside all of our political differences. Frances had a very jaded perspective on all of this. First of all, she hated the fancy parties. She was very recessive. And she didn't believe that these pro-slavery Southerners were going to change one iota. So that was always a source of tension. And finally, after a decade, with him as senator, she said to him, "That's it. I've had it. I'm not going to be your hostess anymore. Our daughter-in-law can take over my duties. I'm going back to Auburn. I'll come back and I'll see you once a year, but I am not going to play this role, which I don't believe in at all. It's not me." And that was a real breakthrough for her. It's hard for us to see just how courageous that was, because until that point, he set the rules and she abided by them when she was in Washington. So she wanted to sign a petition for women's rights. He said, "I don't think that would be a good idea. That would, endanger me politically." He didn't want her to come out as an abolitionist in Washington. That too would be very problematic for him, first as a Whig, then as a Republican, just at the time when they were trying desperately to keep the country together. So she found, when she went back to Auburn, where she had her radical friend, Martha, just around the corner, and Harriet Tubman coming through periodically with enslaved people she had rescued from the Eastern Shore, she was radicalized by these women. They all encouraged each other. They all helped each other. And she created this Underground Railroad station in her former basement kitchen in her house. She donated money to people who were trying to free, and former enslaved people who were trying to free family members. She taught some people who came through the house. She helped them learn to read and write. All of this was extremely subversive. So she did it. She did it quietly, but she did it consistently. And Harriet Tubman really admired her for this. She saw what this took, and she knew how committed Frances was, even though all of their neighbors would have thought, "Oh, Mrs. Seward is a little odd because she doesn't live with her with her husband." But she's a perfectly proper lady, and of course she wasn't remotely. So she did most of her agitating through her letters to her husband, where she was once he became Secretary of State, Lincoln was president, she kept lobbying him and saying the administration must move now on emancipation. It's immoral to allow slavery to continue one more day. There are almost half a million people enslaved in America, and this is just absolutely abhorrent to everything America is supposed to be. And he, of course, argued back.
This is interesting. We're talking about the Frances Seward, the wife of a U.S. senator who is trying not to appear as an abolitionist in Washington, D.C. Underneath their home, back in their home state, is an Underground Railroad station. Do we know how William Seward responded to this?
Yes, he encouraged it. And this is the thing. He's a very complicated character and very appealing in so many ways. And it is absolutely true that he devoted most of his career to being very outspoken against slavery. So he came home one time, and for one unusual occasion, Frances had to be away, and a couple of fugitive slaves stopped at the house, and he wrote to Frances, "Oh, the Underground Railroad works wonderfully. These people came last night, and their watchdog had snapped at one of them." So he was okay with that. He just didn't want her to flout this in Washington, where it could prove politically dangerous, politically damaging to him.
Does everyone in how does this work? Does everyone in the neighborhood realize that there is a train station underneath the neighbor's house?
No, and of course, it's not a literal train station. It's an Underground Railroad stop, as is Martha Coffin Wright's kitchen. So Frances got the idea from her friend Martha, who had been harboring slaves since the 1840s. Frances began quite a bit later. So no, Auburn was, for the most part, an extremely conservative town. It was an industrial town, and there were a lot of bankers and lawyers and farmers. So they tended to be, and that's why they were so appalled by Martha, who didn't send her children to church. She just was such an outlier, and they just found her really dangerous, literally dangerous. But Frances Seward was just much more circumspect, and she kept very much to herself. She was she wasn't a shut-in exactly, but she had health problems. She was chronically she had chronic depression. She had migraine headaches, none of which, of course, at the time were properly diagnosed. So she really struggled, and some of it, I believe, was due to her being, sort of forced into this structured life that she didn't really didn't suit her.
How and when do Harriet Tubman, Martha Wright, and Frances Seward meet?
Yes, and this is the great unanswered historical question. However, the historians who have studied this, and I agree with them, speculate that. All right, so let me back up just a little bit. In 1849, Harriet Tubman walks out of slavery from Poplar Neck, Maryland, almost 100 miles, all alone. She leaves her husband, her siblings, and her parents. She walks to Philadelphia, which she's heard through all of the Underground Railroad contacts in that little rural part of Maryland, that Philadelphia is a city where Black people can get jobs. There are schools for Black children. It sounds like a heaven to her. So she finds it. She walks to Philadelphia. She immediately is taken in by a group that helps fugitive slaves. And she makes it her business to get to know every abolitionist in town. One of the big abolitionists is Martha Coffin Wright's older sister, Lucretia Mott. They become quite close, Harriet and Lucretia, and they understand each other perfectly. Harriet Tubman is incredibly religious. She doesn't read a word, but she's memorized entire passages of the Bible. Lucretia Mott is a Quaker, and Harriet Tubman believes that God speaks directly to her. Lucretia Mott is a Quaker, and Quakers, of course, have this inner light, and so they feel that they have a direct channel to God, and so they just totally understood each other. So it is believed, and I totally believe this, that Martha would often make family visits to Philadelphia to see her beloved older sister. I believe that it was Lucretia Mott who introduced Harriet Tubman to Martha because she was an invaluable contact right in the middle of upstate New York, which was a great route on the way to Canada from New York City, basically straight across the center of the state, all the way up to Canada. Then when Tubman came through Auburn, Martha must have introduced Tubman to Frances Seward. And all three of these women, this was at a time, probably very early 1850s, when both Martha and Frances were beginning to really find themselves as rebels. And Harriet Tubman was this incredible inspiration to them both. She had left her husband and gone on her own. She was kind of the embodiment of what abolition could be and what Black people could do, if they were allowed to do it. So they in turn supported Tubman. They hid enslaved people in their basement kitchens. And then when Harriet Tubman decided she was going to go to Port Royal, South Carolina, at that point she had known Frances Seward for just about a decade, and she knew her well enough to ask her to take care of her niece, her 10-year-old niece, Margaret Stewart, while she was gone. So that ended up being a 3-year project. Frances was totally happy to help out, and she taught her to read and write, and she basically taught her, as one of the Margaret Stewart descendants said, she taught her how to be a lady. And so I think that this was Tubman's way of preparing this niece whom she loved to be a free woman in a new America, because Tubman never had any doubt that the Union was going to win the war.
The 1850s, when it's believed that Harriet Tubman, Martha Wright, and Frances Seward met, is such an interesting decade. This is the decade before the Civil War. I remember at the very beginning of the Trump administration, I went to Washington, D.C., because I'm a former Capitol Hill correspondent, and I sat down with the Senate historian, Betty Coed. and I was just trying to get a grasp of what's going on. It's everything's so crazy, and I asked her, is there any other time in history that the politics have been so strife? And of course, she just laughed at me, said, "Yeah, of course, the 1850s." And I've spent the 4 years since studying the 1850s pretty closely. I mean, this is a decade when we have what's known as Bleeding Kansas. This is
Yes.
literally guerrilla warfare in the air in the middle of the country of today, over whether or not these new states that are being added to the union were going to be slave states or not.
Yes, and it was a huge. That was a huge issue. Bleeding Kansas, which again, if you haven't been in high school or you haven't studied history in college or graduate school, some people don't know very little about Bleeding Kansas. But that's where John Brown really began his whole sort of revolutionary. I mean, he had been a militant abolitionist for his entire adult life, but he went out to Bleeding Kansas and he helped foment a lot of that uprising. And this was basically between free state settlers who had come almost entirely from the Northeast at the beginning. They were subsidized by an abolitionist group in Massachusetts and then in New York. And so they were, they went out in their wagons and they built a city called Lawrence, Kansas, and they're on the border with Missouri, which is a slave state. And the Missourians are horrified. And the Southerners, the deep Southern or deep South Southerners, wanted Kansas, when it entered the Union, to be a slave state. So pretty soon, a former U.S. senator, his name was David Wright Atchison, who's from Missouri, he basically starts organizing this little army, and he starts sending them across the border. And they're effectively the white supremacists of the day, and they were trying to make sure by going across the border during the first legislative elections to stuff the ballot boxes and make sure that this legislature was a pro-slavery legislature. It was completely illegal. It was incredibly violent, and these guerrilla operatives ended up riding in, over 1,000 of them, riding into Lawrence, Kansas, and burning down the town. So that John Brown, rushed to the aid in Lawrence to help, and so he was even more radicalized after that. And eventually, he made his way. He sort of figured out his plan to, take over the armory at Harper's Ferry, and everyone knows that story. What happened there?
In preparing for our conversation, I did watch an event online that you participated in recently, in which you compared these people that are coming from Missouri, were known as border ruffians.
Yes.
And you kind of compared that to the people who stormed the Capitol building on January 6th.
Yes, I mean that occurred to me because I was working on an excerpt of the book for the New Yorker, which is where I'm an editor, and so I decided to open it with that comparison because until that point on January 6th, even though I'd done all this work on the 1850s, and even though I covered politics at the New Yorker, I kept telling myself it's very, very bad. We have the Proud Boys and all these other groups. They're incredibly violent, but it's not as bad as it was in the 1850s. And that day, watching the Capitol be, ransacked, I thought, no, this is where it's happening again.
Interesting. This is an important period of time that we're living through. And it's also interesting, and I don't mean to get us too off topic, and I'm going to bring us back in just a moment before we wrap up. But it does make me think about the battle that is happening right now over access to the ballot that's happening in the states across the country, and then also what's happening in Washington, D.C. as Democrats are trying to push through H.R. 1. And I mean, this in right now we just have two sides that see each other as existential threats to the country. And at the heart of that is this access to the ballot. And it just seems to me, I just bring this up since you do write about politics. It just seems to me this is a really critical moment that we're living through right now.
It is a really critical moment. I think 43 states are working on laws to suppress the vote. 43 states. Now, thankfully, there are movements to counter that effort by Stacey Abrams and many others. And they've made great headway. But it's worth emphasizing, and I think no one can dismiss that after what we saw on January 6th, that this is an existential threat to our democracy. And that's all there is to it. They are a minority. There's no question. The really violent crusaders we saw in Washington. However, we've seen how compliant and the Republican Congress is, and the fact that these efforts are underway in all of these states is extremely worrisome.
Yeah. Okay. Back to the story of Harriet Tubman, Martha Wright, and Frances Seward in our remaining minutes here. I wanted to ask you about the letters of Frances Seward and Martha Wright. These are letters that were almost lost to history, it seems.
They were. So when I started the book, I had been enraged by a comment by William Seward's first biographer. I became interested in her because she seemed like such a complicated person who was shut in her house, but yet she was more radical than he was. So I read this early biographer by Glendon Van Dusen, and he essentially just brushed her aside as a neurotic invalid. And I thought, well, that can't possibly be true. How then was she arguing with her husband all the time about, freeing the slaves? So I called the University of Rochester, which holds the collection of the Seward papers, and I asked if Frances Seward's letters still existed. And this young curator said yes. And as a matter of fact, when they were first donated in the 1950s, they were set aside. Those boxes were set aside by Frances. The letters by Frances were set aside as worthless. So that was just like, it was both gold to a researcher and infuriating to me because how could anybody possibly think they were worthless when she was writing to her husband 3 or 4 times a week, through the 1850s, through the Civil War. This is one of the most important statesmen the country's ever had. But then I sort of thought, well, people have barely, touched these things, and they weren't digitized yet. There now is a process underway of digitizing them. So I went to the library, I started reading them, and I was just blown away by how revelatory they were. She was a wonderful writer. She wrote in the early 1830s about how her sister Lizette was being brutally beaten by her husband. And it was just when she wrote about her first experience of slavery, watching how enslaved people were treated in Virginia. So I could see, and then I hired someone to help me transcribe the letters. And over the course of the years, you can just completely see the trajectory of her politics and how dramatically she changed. And then their daughter, Fanny Seward, kept a diary, and that was incredible too. And I won't give away the ending, but just after the war ends, there's this horrendous attack, and it's all there in family letters and in Fanny's diary. So this attack on William Seward. So I was able to piece all that together and recreate that scene that night, and it's really something. Martha, on the other hand, I found out about. There was one scholarly biography written about her, and it was by 2 scholars who were married, and one of whom was a descendant of Martha Coffin Wright, and so they had read and transcribed quite a few of the letters, and so I read that book, and I realized reading the book, she was hilarious. She was so no nonsense and funny and scathing about all of these laws these men had created, and what did they know? So I went. Those letters are at Smith College in the Sophia Smith collection. So I went there and I started reading more of those letters, and I realized I would have the arc of her life too. So that was really the beginning of this book. It ended up being a much more ambitious project than I had quite anticipated, but never regretted it for a minute. It was really revelatory.
Seward's first biographer, you said, called Frances Seward a neurotic invalid. Why invalid? Did Frances Seward have a disability that she did have? She had chronic, really migraine headaches. They would have been diagnosed today, and she had chronic depression. And I later learned from a Seward, one of her descendants,
that this was a family trait that was handed down through almost every generation of the Seward family. But of course, no one understood depression at the time, and so it was, nor did they apparently in the 1950s. So it was just, oh, she was just neurotic, and so she took to her bed. She did the things that people were taught to do at the time. You know, that the flickering gas lights would give her a horrible headache. And we now sort of understand that that's a trigger for people. That would be a trigger for people who have migraine headaches. But you know, we're talking about an age of really rudimentary medicine, and women were basically just given it was essentially a tincture of opium every time they complained about anything, and it was all attributed to female maladies that had something to do with their disordered reproductive system. It was just it was miserable. So she knew. I mean, she was smart enough to figure out that her unhappiness in her marriage and in her life had something to do with her physical maladies, but she couldn't really understand, and it didn't do any good. I do think she felt infinitely more fulfilled once she broke away from her husband physically and decided that she was going to live effectively her own life in Auburn. But she had a pretty tough time of it. It was not a happy marriage.
And Harriet Tubman, didn't she have a traumatic brain injury?
She did. When she was just a young, very young girl, in Maryland, it was called renting out. She was rented out by the slaveholder who so-called owned her for a fee. And so she was at another plantation. She was sent to pick up something at a local dry goods store. A young man had escaped from slavery, and the overseer, who was trying to catch him, picked up an iron weight off the counter of this store and threw it at the young man, and it hit Harriet Tubman in the head, and it cracked her skull. And it ended up, it was a lasting, terrible injury. So she too had blinding headaches for her whole life. Those had an obvious physical source. And it gave rise to visions that she thought were prophetic. And she predicted quite a few things that are just uncanny. There's no way exactly to describe them. And it became, she was very handicapped, but it didn't stop her. And this is one of the remarkable things about her. She just kept carrying on. She would sometimes pass out in the middle of a sentence, and then she'd wake up, a minute or so later and would just continue as if nothing had happened.
It does seem significant to me that two of these women, at a minimum, that you write about had disabilities.
Yes, absolutely.
Dorothy Wickenden has been our guest. Dorothy Wickenden is the executive editor of the New Yorker magazine. She also writes for the magazine and is moderator of its weekly podcast. It's called Politics and More. She is the author of the book, The Agitators, Three Friends Who Fought for Abolition and Women's Rights. Dorothy Wickenden, I have enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you for taking this time to join us today.
Thank you so much for asking. I've enjoyed it a lot, too.